A warm welcome to the third episode of Holcim Awards webinar series organized in collaboration with EcoGradia. My name is Priya Pawar and I am the Holcim Awards Program Manager at the Holcim Foundation. The Holcim Awards have been organized by the Foundation since 2004 to support and empower change accelerators for sustainable construction. Over the past 2 decades, the competition has gathered close to 30,000 entries from 130 countries spanning 5 geographical regions. The 2023 cycle of the Holcim Awards received a total of 500 submissions, and from the eligible entries, 20 winners were selected by distinguished panel of jurors. The topic of today's podcast is Industrial Architecture for Efficiency and Well-being, and I am pleased to see that people from over 55 countries have registered to join our webinar today. To share insights on sustainability in their parts of world, our two guests, Lei Kwang, who is the principal at Lei Kwang Architects in Berlin, Germany. Their project, the Post-COVID Factory, won the Holcim Awards 2023 Acknowledgement Prize in Asia Pacific region. The second of today's guest is Chris Helster. Chris is the Director of Living Building Challenge Services at Miller Hull Partnership in Seattle, US. Their project, Maritime Innovation Centre, won Holcim Awards 2023 Silver Prize in the North American region. Kwang, Chris, would you join me, please? Welcome.
Yes, thanks, Priya, for having me.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks, Priya.
Today's session will be hosted by Dr. Nirmal Krishnani, host of EcoGradia podcast, who's a leading author and educator in the field of sustainable design. Nirmal, would you also join us, please?
Hi, Priya. It's great to be back.
On behalf of Holcim Foundation, we are delighted that you all have joined us today. Welcome, and thank you, Nirmal, for hosting today's podcast.
My pleasure.
Kwang, you're in Berlin, where it's afternoon. Chris, you're presently in Seattle, where it's very early morning. And Nirmal, you're in Singapore, where it's very late evening. As the webinar occurs in 3 different time zones, for our guest and our host, we express our great appreciation for your enthusiastic participation. Before I go, a word to our audience. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's conversation. You may type your questions into the comment box. Dr. Krishnani will try to include as many as time permits. Nirmal, I leave the webinar in your good hands, and I will see everybody later. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. Kwang, Chris, it's a great pleasure to see you again. I want to talk about the specifics of your 2 projects and the theme that connects both of them. The question that affects the industrial workspace is one of balancing well-being of the occupant, the worker, against the efficiency of the workflows. So the COVID pandemic, I think, taught us that health and economic considerations are intertwined, right? And for the industrial workspace, there is no work from home. And so the answer lies in a rethink of the industrial typology. So let's dive into the 2 projects. Chris, you're an architect and a Living Building Challenge Service Director based in Seattle, USA. The jury for North America in awarding your team a silver had much praise. Now, jurors noted the adaptive reuse approach, the repurposing of an existing 100-year-old building, the exceptional energy efficiency achieved by balancing passive and active systems, the integration of many different programs within a very compact volume, thereby optimizing land use and promoting community life. Huang Lei, you are also an architect, but based in Berlin, Germany. The jury awarded your team an acknowledgement for the Asia Pacific region. The jurors singled out the repurposing of industrial sites, the quest for better indoor and outdoor work environment, a dense yet permeable massing with green space. They noted the project's approach to harmonizing agriculture with industry, which begins to reimagine Vietnam's industrial landscape. Before we get into the conversation, please walk me through your projects. Let's start with you, Quang.
Our factory project is part of the holistic industrial master plan that we developed in South Vietnam. This was an old agriculture city in the past. Our concept focused on developing a new type of industrial zone that is ecologically friendly and reasonable in land use management. By placing the multiple agriculture landscape in the center, we are planning the traffic flow and approach of the logistic vehicle in the more efficient way. The building density is reduced, but it still ensures the benefit of the client. The first construction project starts here. By carefully studying the production line, we optimize the building footprint in a strategy that smaller is better, leaving more space for the agriculture land. These agriculture courtyards become a kind of socialization spaces, helping to improve the quality of the working environment for workers. In addition, it also regulates the climate, cooling, and filter the rainwater. We named this factory is a post-COVID factory because after the pandemic, we recognize the factory here in Vietnam is not only for working and making blast profit, it also needs a certain concern about a new type of ventilation, comfort, cooling, and working environment. Thanks.
Thank you, Quang. I mean, I've been to Đồng Nai, and it is a very intensive industrial landscape. I mean, it's one of the largest industrial areas in Southeast Asia. More than half of the population actually work in factories. So I'm really curious to see how you address the question of well-being. We'll come to that in a minute. Would you summarize your proposal now, Chris?
Sure. The Maritime Innovation Centre is the Port of Seattle's oldest building at about 110 years. The project is approximately 14,000 square feet, and it's part of the working waterfront just north of downtown Seattle, Washington, located in what's known as Fisherman's Terminal. For years, the building has been underutilized, but the port believed that its life wasn't over. So Miller Hull and our expert team of consultants are renovating the building to provide office, conference, and educational space to support a nonprofit tenant working to create a blue economy, the greening of the shipping industry with things like hybrid ships and green-collar workforce. The Maritime Innovation Centre is pursuing the Living Building Challenge, the world's most stringent green building rating system. This requires a project to operate at net positive energy and net positive water, and to prove its performance for at least a year's worth of occupancy. This all-electric building, powered entirely by photovoltaics, will have a host of efficiency and performance features, including full gray and black water treatment system. The project will comply with the strict requirements of prohibiting red list chemicals. This is the most common and toxic ingredients in our building products and materials. And improvements in daylighting, natural ventilation, and indoor air quality will create a healthier working environment in the building for scores of fishers and other maritime professionals.
Thank you, Chris. I am somewhat familiar with the LBC, the Living Building Challenge, and I have questions for you on how you achieved it, because it is an incredibly stringent target. But let's take a step back for a minute. Tell me a little bit about the context of your project. I mean, Quang, I talked about Đồng Nai as this kind of industrial landscape. Tell me a little bit about where this building is situated, and what is the nature of the work that takes place inside the building?
Yes, so Đồng Nai is one of the biggest industrial zone in South Vietnam. Actually, before long time ago, it has been be agriculture area, which is produced like a lot of rice and food for the people. But because of the development process, so day by day it's become more industrial zone than the agricultural zone. So as a result of that process, like I think it's good because it's provide more work, more job, more income for the local people here. But in the same time, we had some trouble about the ground contamination and the work environment, because it is kind of difficult for people to switch from become from the farmer to be like a worker with such an intensive process, So that is the context of our project. And for the factory we build is for the wooden furniture manufacture production line.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's quite a sizable building. It's 26,000 square meters, almost occupying the entire site. The Maritime Innovation Centre is a fraction of that, less than a tenth. Chris, can you tell me a little bit about the building and what it contains and where it is situated?
Yeah, we're not quite as industrial as Laquang's project there. A small industrial neighborhood, but kind of situated between some residential neighborhoods within Seattle. And it is a working waterfront. That's what's unique about this particular project. The Port of Seattle has long held this land and is currently occupied by quite a fishing industry here that works along this waterfront. So the building is in a really active location, and it's just been run down over the recent years. So it's really great to see the Port of Seattle's commitment to bring this back, which will now become this hub for really innovation for the new economy, really helping to green their entire fleet and kind of protect the very waters that these fishers work in. So it's really exciting to see this transformation of one of their oldest projects.
What does a hub mean? I mean, is it is it an industrial space with laboratories and workshops, or is it an office space? I mean, what is the nature of the work that takes place inside this building?
It's a little bit of both, yeah. So they're going to have some industrial space to help incubate some other maritime businesses as they're getting off the ground and developing some of these new technologies like hybrid shipping and things like that. And it certainly is an office component and conference space as well. It's intended to be a meeting area for the entire Fisherman's Terminal. There will likely be many different events that are hosted here publicly with the Port of Seattle and the various fishing community events that happen. So a little bit of everything.
Right. So, I mean, what stands out about both your projects is the emphasis on occupant well-being and community. Before we get into the details of that, I want to ask this question of what was it like at the early stage of design? How did you make a case to your client to incorporate these considerations? I mean, a lot of industrial buildings are, commercially owned and therefore very profit oriented. I mean, how did you flip the script, as it were? Quang, Vietnam, particularly challenging, right? How did you talk to your client? What was the thinking there that allowed you to do what you had to do?
I guess in my case, actually, it's quite different, like the normal case, because the client come to us and asking that, because like during as you mentioned before, like for COVID, there is no work from home for the worker, so they lock down and everyone just going back to their hometown. And then after the lockdown, it's so difficult for all the factories to have them back, because they just stay there. So that's why the client they came to us and they just giving the requirement, like, can you do like a new type of factory, giving the better working environment, but it has to be at the same cost as they invested before. Yeah, so it is what happened to me.
But so what you're saying then is that the client saw well-being and the worker welfare as a way of attracting and retaining workers post-COVID. When people were reluctant to come back to factories, they saw this attribute of the building as a way of kind of attracting people back in. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And I have to say, like, sometimes we have to wait such a thing like the pandemic to have that kind of mentality from the client, which is, I think, is quite late. But anyway, at least they start to think about that.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, you're right. I mean, everywhere in the world, the COVID pandemic has made us rethink what it means to be in a work environment. Chris, talk a little bit about the early conversations with the client. Why such an emphasis on well-being and community engagement, and how does that integrate with the workflow and the production, the productivity of that environment?
Yeah, for us, we were fortunate to really be bolstered by the Port of Seattle's Century Agenda, they call it. They had this ambitious goal to become really what is the greenest port in North America. That's their specific requirements. So when we first heard about that, it really just kind of made sense to align with something like the Living Building Challenge. We're fortunate enough to have the most experience with this of any architect in the world. We have 6 certified living building projects now. And so when we think about something that becomes the greenest for a particular client, that really aligns with something that has proven performance like Living Building Challenge, where we can show exactly what we can do by using natural resources to power the building, to treat its own water, and then really provide, as you say, some healthy requirements for the tenants there. And we knew that that was an important criteria there. And Living Building Challenge has long been aligned with those types of requirements, focusing on natural ventilation, really healthy indoor air requirements, and all these things that we now are having a much greater emphasis on now that we've gone through a pandemic.
Right, right. It's interesting. In a funny sort of way, both your projects are driven by its context, right? I mean, in the case of the Maritime Innovation Centre, it was driven by the Port of Seattle's broader agenda to be a green port. And
Right.
in Kwang, in your case, the factory was really trying to set itself apart from other factories by providing a different kind of work environment. That's interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the specific features and strategies that simultaneously address the operational needs of the factory or that space, the environmental performance, and occupant well-being. Yeah. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you did, and were these different drivers in sync? Or were there times when, say, operational workflow was at odds with environmental impact? And if so, what were the conflicts and how did you resolve it? Let's start with you, Chris. Well, give me an example of some of the strategies that you deployed and how that kind of fit into the larger scheme.
Sure. Well, we're guided by the Living Building Challenge framework for this particular project. If you're not familiar, the idea is really to have buildings that mimic a natural element. A flower is what they use. So thinking about how a building can really operate completely from all the energy that falls on it, gather all the water that it's needed for it, really kind of meeting the carrying capacity of the site. And so that's really what kind of aligned our particular design focus. We've got photovoltaics that are part of this project. So that's the entire energy system. We've got a backup battery system as well for some resilience components. And then the water system is really the most complicated part of the Living Building Challenge these days, making sure that we are being able to collect the rainwater that we need, and then treating all of the gray and black water on site with particular equipment that is housed within the building. And here we had a little bit unique challenge that the Port of Seattle land here is actually built over what's an old estuary. So the ground isn't really set up for kind of this full recharge that we would expect on a more natural site system. So we have to really work with the pre-existing water flows on the site. Living Building Challenge asks us to kind of reimagine what the previous ecology was of a site. And so really working with that industrial transformation today became kind of a challenge, but we were able to find ways to meet that and improve the water quality for the area.
Right, right. But one of the things that struck me about this, the architecture of this building, was the emphasis on passive design, and here I think, for instance, apart from the metrics of water and energy, the
Yeah.
occupant well-being is so much driven by access to daylight and ventilation. So you had a huge polycarbonate facade, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That kind of one gable facade is all made out of polycarbonate that lets a lot of diffuse light in. Tell me a little bit about how you kind of balance passive and active systems in the climate of Seattle.
Yeah, I think, from a design standpoint, one of our first tenets was really not to mess up what was already there. It has a classic look to this building, over 100 years old. So we really wanted to work with the existing massing, the existing materials, and find a way for it to reflect something that was industrial. So you mentioned the polycarbonate. We don't want anything that's too precious out there. It's a working waterfront. But we want to be able to kind of utilize that daylighting in a new way. The existing building didn't have a lot of access to daylight or natural ventilation. So this reimagines kind of what that can be by keeping the same massing, similar industrial materials, but really focusing on a way that we can now bring that natural light into this working waterfront space and allow the tenants to have operable windows at every space so that they can influence their own environment and really take advantage of those nice maritime breezes right on the coast there as well.
No, I think it lends itself to a very a beautiful biophilic interior, and the other thing that looking at the images of this project, the other thing that stands out is the reuse of materials, a lot of timber. So there is a very strong
Right.
biophilic component. Again, I guess what I'm asking is how the two objectives kind of synergize. So you have daylighting, but that also reduces operational costs. You have a biophilic material. Talk to me about how you brought these different ideas together into a certain logic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reusing these existing materials is important, certainly from a carbon standpoint. But then, as you mentioned, there's some biophilic qualities, certainly, as we all kind of go towards the idea of seeing wood and natural wood in our projects. And I think those things really help people to be grounded a little bit more. We've certainly heard that from our other projects where people really respond well to kind of seeing the exposed wood, having the connection to their exterior a little bit more, being able to have a view out of their windows, being able to control their own natural environment and get the ventilation and air quality that they need. And I think when people are more grounded to those things, it certainly creates a better wellness for our workspaces.
Sure.
And we feel like those things should be brought to these industrial spaces as well. So those
Right.
things really seem to go well together.
Right. I mean, I think they apply as a principle. This applies to any building typology, but perhaps particularly so for industrial typology.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if there were moments where the two things were at odds. Did you have situations where you were kind of forced to make a choice or a compromise?
Not really in this particular project. I think, the utilizing the existing building really helps. And I think, this is the palette that we have to work with. And instead of trying to cover it up or change materials, really honoring what was there in the past, building buildings out of these strong timber members was really how the waterfront was built 100 years ago. And so being able to continue to utilize those same materials and honor them today, I think didn't really put anything at odds. I think we still, as humans and interested in design, ground towards those natural materials.
Right, right. Kwang, you didn't have so much of a history of the site to work with. I mean, in a way, Đồng Nai is very much an industrial landscape. Everything that was there is gone.
Yes,
Everything has been rebuilt into something new. So you don't have the legacy of the past. But interestingly, what emerged in the post-COVID factory is a similar approach. There was a strong emphasis on daylighting and ventilation. You talk about harnessing the rain, the wind, and the sun, creating cooling systems for better indoor conditions. Talk me through the thinking of why these elements were so important for indoor comfort.
Yes, I think for in our case, the factory in Đồng Nai is and the climate here is quite different with the Chris case because, as you know, like in the Southeast Asia, we have just too much sunlight and too much rainwater. In the same time, I think it's good because we can, I mean, the sun is important and it's kind of interesting to give that kind of quality for the worker. But in our case, we try to block the sun, because the sun here is not only like giving the quality, but it also is warm up
Right.
everything.
Right.
So our passage design, we try to block all the direct sun and giving the natural ventilation and the natural light for the worker through the indirect solution. So the sun is going to be heat up the garden, and then from the garden is go inside to the factory. So basically, we cool down the temperature inside the factory shed. And on the another hand, I mean, for the rain, I have to say the rain for us is causing more trouble than the benefit, So we try to having more permeable surface to absorb the water, and we collect as well the rainwater to reuse this. Yeah.
So it led to a strategy of pocket gardens. The architecture is kind of interrupted by these courtyards, which act as they basically reduce the plant depth, so you get good cross ventilation and daylight, but they also create little pockets of coolness in the overall architecture.
Yes.
That's interesting. I want to know, is either of your projects completed? Have you been able to do a post-occupancy audit? Chris, is it completed? Is it occupied?
Not yet. Ours is under construction right now.
Okay, and Kwang, is yours occupied? It is.
Yes. Yeah. For
So
us
let
the
me ask you,
same, yeah.
Kwang, have you done a post-occupancy survey? Do you know if people actually like what you have given them?
Yes, actually, because we do some interview for the local workers there, and by the way, we look at their daily life, and then we recognize, as you mentioned before, like in Đồng Nai, we don't have that much legacy as what Chris had in his area. But personally, I think our legacy is the Dutch people who actually being there, they used to be farmers, which is like kind of the legacy for
Right.
themselves, So we provide that culture is not only from beautification, the project, but also, because as a farmer, they always like to farm. I mean, like they're always planting something at their house, on the roof, in the terraces. So we use that courtyard gardening as how to say, like the healing how to say the healing solution for them. So they feel actually for sure, I think they won't feel better when they are being close to the farm.
Sure.
which is-
I have questions for you regarding the farming strategy. I think that's a really interesting way to reinterpret landscapes. So we'll come to that. But I just want to know. So you've spoken to the occupants, and they tell you that they like it or that they enjoy it. What about the owner of the building? Have they seen the impact that they intended? Like, for example, is there greater worker retention? Is there greater productivity? I mean, what are the metrics of success here?
Yes, I think basically I think it's become like the compromise between the owner of the factory and the worker. So as we talked before, like they try to use factory as an attractive
Yes.
point for the worker, So in the end of the day, they say, okay, for this garden, a group of worker can spend like, I don't know, 2 hours per week or 3 hours per week to take care for that. And very important, like by somehow, the farmer, they like to eat the vegetable made by themselves, like it's kind of the happiness, like a very traditional happiness. So that's why they won't, I think in the end of the day, they're going to make the deal between the worker and the owner of the factory. Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about happiness. One of your country's best-known architects, Huang Tak Hao, I'm sure you've heard of his name. He often talks about an architecture of happiness, and that is about bringing people close to nature, of giving them back this sense of relationship with the natural environment. Chris, I know your building's not completed yet, but what will be the measure of its success?
Well, certainly the Living Building Challenge performance period helps to really guide that. I mean, we'll be monitoring it very closely this first year, day to day, taking readings around energy performance and water performance. Those are certainly some guiding metrics. But then I think longer than that is really just exactly what you're asking Laquang about is how do people feel about it? How is this successful in terms of really being in this incubator space for the client, the tenant that's going to be there, the Maritime Blue, and do people like coming to work there? Do they feel a sense of pride in protecting the very waters that they're serving, the very environment that they're so connected to? Just like with Laquang, as you say, the people being close to the farms. I think we're experiencing very similar components here, where the fishers are coming right off their vessels and walking right into this to this building and working on things that they're going to take back to their ship and take out to enhance their job, and really being a part of that community that's rooted in this environment.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but that's an interesting parallel that where Quang is with his project is trying to bring farming and food production back in. The Maritime Centre is also a kind of farming. You're by the sea fishing.
Certainly.
That's,
yeah.
So sustenance, food, becomes the common denominator in well-being.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
totally.
Exactly, and there's living building pieces that are tied to that. They're expanding the availability of people selling directly off of the ships for seafood for the community. There's even an urban agriculture component that we've brought these gardens and pea patches to other neighborhoods around the area that'll really expand the farming that's available to them right in the city. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. I think it's exact. And one more additional thing in Vietnam, for the farmer here, like doing farming is kind of the land ownership mentality. If you do farm somewhere, it means like you belong to the land, or the land belongs to you. It's how they feel. I mean, like, if you get to know in our history, like the land use and that mentality is kind of quite popular.
I mean, it's also relevant that Đồng Nai used to be a farming community, and so now it's transformed to an industrial condition. I want to ask you, Quang, this idea of bringing farming into an industrial context has been done by other architects before, and here I'm thinking specifically of Vô Trong Nha. In Vietnam, I'm sure you know Vô Trong Nha. He's very well known. Vô Trong Nha did a kindergarten in an industrial estate belonging to a factory, where he converted the roof of the kindergarten into a farm. So I asked him, how well used is it? Do they actually grow vegetables? And who looks after it? So let me ask you the same question. Yeah. In this farm that you imagine in the middle of your factory, who's going to look after it? And what happens to the produce when it is produced?
Yes, I think in our factory, the worker is the main character who taking care for the garden. I think as you look at a lot of the project about, one thing I have to say about the agriculture landscape is you don't need that much cost to do the maintenance. Like if you build like such a holistic, beautiful landscape, you're gonna have someone who take care for that. But for the landscape agriculture, the good point is actually people they have to taking care for that, so at least you win the cost. And by the way, I told you before, people, they would love to have their own vegetables for eating, or so in the end of the day, I think they do it themselves, they use this themselves,
creates a connection.
Of course they can. Yeah, exactly. They create a connection. So is what I always think the agriculture landscape. If you look at the rice field in the summer or in the spring, it's extremely beautiful. And honestly, I mean, you don't have that much people who have to be there every day and every time to.
Yeah, I think that is a common narrative that a lot of people who end up in these industrial estates, and they do it out of necessity because they come there to make a living, but they come from an agricultural past. They come from villages, and they come from places where growing food is a very intuitive kind of everyday affair. I want to ask you, Chris, about Living Building Challenge. Why LBC? It's a really, I've read the details on the Living Building Challenge certification, and it's really hard to achieve. I mean,
It is.
the red list of materials, for instance, is very difficult to manage. So what made you decide on the Living Building Challenge, and talk me through some of the difficulties that you faced getting there?
Yeah. Well, I've been fortunate to work with Living Buildings since 2009. I did my first project back with the Birchie School here in Seattle, one of the world's first living buildings, and then just continued to develop that here with Miller Hull. And we now have 6 projects that are certified in various typologies and around the United States. It really just makes sense. I mean, this is how buildings should be built today. These are something we can achieve. We have the engineering solutions to accomplish what Living Building Challenge asks of us. But it does require a little bit of a change in how we might design or how we think about things. Certainly, there is more of an integrated design aspect. You're asking, conflicts about things and how do these synergies develop. And Living Building really asks us to look at the site a bit more, find out what the context is asking of us, of the ecology, and then making sure that our disciplines working together are really solving these issues simultaneously. We're not working in these vacuums of having a meeting with a structural engineer and then we go and have a separate meeting with a mechanical engineer. It's about everybody being together with the user group and kind of solving all these design challenges throughout the project. And for us, a specific one, I think the most challenging is really around the water.
Right.
Again, we have the engineering solutions for these, but oftentimes the jurisdictional requirements are what differs. So we've even dealt with that on this particular project. The original design, as a living building asks us to, is to collect all the rainwater that we're going to use for potable needs, to be able to drink the rainwater within the building. And our first designs had that, but since our project was under design, the state of Washington actually changed their guidelines and no longer allows commercial buildings to be able to treat and drink their own rainwater. Although we have other buildings that do that already, they're grandfathered in. So that was a design change that really forced us to look at things a little bit differently through the challenge, but still be able to be efficient with our water use and be able to kind of mimic the original environmental conditions here on site.
Are you familiar, Kwang, with the Living Building Challenge?
I think it's quite new for me.
Sorry.
Right. Yes.
Now, I was just wondering whether you think that such a certification tool would ever take off in Vietnam, or how difficult it would be to implement in a different context from Seattle. But let me ask you a question, Kwang. You talk about your building being low cost. USD $300 per square meter, I think you said. Give me a sense of what that is. I mean, how much does the typical factory building in Vietnam cost compared to what you built?
Yes, in our case, the 300 USD per square meter is only the cost for building up the massing of the factory, which is basically our factory is just like a shed, So honestly, that cost is quite popular here, They won't build everything with that kind of cost, like around 250, 300 USD per square meter. So I have to say, like, our low-cost solution is just about, we build something better, but in the same cost as the normal thing happen here, which is exactly what the clients they expect to do, because our goal is make it perform better.
Right.
Yeah, in the better way. I mean, if you work for the Vietnamese client, I have to say you can propose something super cool, super nice. But if the cost is high, or if you need to do extra cost for it, is going to be very challenging
So
to.
they won't pay more. They won't pay more.
Yeah,
But what you are able to do is to provide more value for the dollar. That's what you're saying.
yeah,
So
exactly.
for the same price.
Yeah.
What about you, Chris?
Mhm.
Did your approach cost more upfront? Were there returns, over the life of the building? How is cost understood for an industrial typology?
Yeah, well, being a public project certainly has public scrutiny around it, and using the public's funds responsibly is something that's really critical with the Port of Seattle here. And so we knew that was going to be a part going into this. For living buildings, typically there is a small premium. They seem to vary depending on the type of building and location. And certainly in Seattle, we unfortunately have a really hot building climate here, and in terms of economy, rather. And so we really are kind of I guess struggling with the amount of premium that's placed on construction around here.
Right.
The building industry is very busy here. There really is quite a significant premium to build in the city right now. So balancing those things with the initial costs is one of the struggles that we kind of see on every project. Certainly, we saw a pandemic increase and supply chain disruptions that really changed things quite a bit. But overall, really able to stay within the budget that the port had originally set out by making these smart choices, reusing existing portions of the building. And then certainly over the lifetime of the building, the port will see a great value in that. I mean, there will be no utility bills for this building. They're not going to pay energy or water costs for them for the life of the building. And for an owner that keeps a project for many years, that really makes a lot of sense to them. They'll get a lot of return on that.
What do you think on the premium of upfront costs? What is the payback on these different systems?
Yeah, they vary by system, and so certainly the photovoltaic system will pay back in a few years. The water treatment system is going to be longer than that, but there's a greater value in again protecting the environment that they're serving, to be able for the fishers to say that they're not running off any stormwater that's going to harm the very fish populations they're working in every day, to be able to treat their own water and drink their own water here, and even handle all their waste on site, I think provides this really great sense of responsibility and connection for these people to the very environment they're working in. And of course, the long-term payback that the client will receive is another bonus.
Right. One of the things I find really interesting about the Holcim Awards winners is that notwithstanding the size of the project, there is often a big picture. There is something that the project is setting out to achieve that has ramifications, replicability, or it's going to somehow change the way we think about the typology or we think about construction. What is the big picture here, Chris? I mean, I know your project is a relatively modest size project.
Yeah, I mean, for the Port of Seattle, they've already found some other projects that they're converting into living buildings as well. So they've really taken on this idea, this challenge, and expanded it. And the idea of replicability was certainly an important piece here too. Again, with that goal of becoming the greenest port in North America, they want to show that this is possible. They want to make this a beacon for other ports to follow around the world.
Right.
So I think that's the idea, is to be able to show that these types of buildings work in industrial waterfront. They make sense for the responsible use of public funding. And again, this is how we can be building buildings.
Right. Quang, what about you? Is anyone copying your approach in Vietnam? Does your project have an impact beyond its own site boundaries?
Yes, I think like at the moment I don't see anyone who do the same solution that that we have made. I think because not so many architects here, they are not so interested in doing factories, but at least I think we have some new client who giving us a call, so probably we can offer them the design with the same vision as we provide for this project.
Okay. Well, I hope regulations will change, or somehow it will trigger a market response, because it would be it would be great to
Yes.
see, I mean, in both your cases for some kind of a ripple
Yes.
effect, right?
Yeah. I think do agree. But but somehow I have to say, like in Vietnam, architecture is quite limited. We honestly we have to wait for the policy.
Yes,
All the thing we do is just trying to promote like the policy for the new building code, for the new regulation.
right.
And then I think it's going to be, because factory in the end of the day is huge. I mean, like, we have to face to the fact, like, anyway, Đồng Nai going to be the industrial zone with a lot of massive building and massive amount of people working
Right.
there.
I'm going to flip over now to the Q&A part, and because questions are streaming in, and I'm going to direct the questions to you as we go along. So the first question is to you, Kwang. Interestingly, Edgardo Malari, he wants to know that would you have designed the factory the same way if the owner had not asked for it? To entice the workers to come back. Is it something that is innate to your design practice all along?
Yes, I have to say, like, is what we always try to do to input our study into the design. In this case, we are quite lucky because with the client having more or less the same vision with us. But even in another case, we're trying to apply the same philosophy, the same way to approach, because we always trying to convince the client, like, they don't have to pay more than normal to achieve that kind of quality. So I think it's a win-win situation. Yeah.
Question to you, Chris, from Samita Shetty. How achievable is the living building challenge in developing countries? Since at the moment it seems to be adopted mostly by developed nations, are there any challenges that you foresee in the developing world context?
Yeah, I think the challenge is really applicable to any place around the world. I mean, the challenge is around the world. There are many projects registered around the world. And I think what's great about it is its flexibility. I mean, it asks us to really look at a site's natural characteristics. What is the carrying capacity of that site? What can our building really responsibly do with the ecology of that particular site? It doesn't ask us to try to insert a certain building program onto a certain site. So it's really looking for what the nature is asking of us there. And I think that's a great way to really design for all of us around the world, and no matter what climate we're in. Is getting back to our buildings being much more responsive to their climate, to their program, and to what can really be built there. So I think, yes, it would work anywhere.
No, but I understand Smita's question in that the obligations of certification, of LBC certification, requires a lot of transparency, a lot of data, which, I mean, if I were to project onto a place like Vietnam, if you were trying to do an LCB certified building in Đồng Nai, it would be very difficult to comply with the red list materials, not because it's not the right thing to do, but because there is not the same transparency with suppliers and supply chains. So I mean, I sense that that's where this is coming from, and I kind of do get the point. I mean, it is something that seems to be perhaps, I wouldn't say developed versus developing, but more suited to a place where there is more accountability, shall we say, across the supply chain.
Yeah, and if we're talking about the materials aspects of Red List and the transparency around that, I think that also was something that had to develop in this country. I mean, we're still working on transparency around our materials in the United States, and obviously we source our materials and products from all around the world, and so we've gone through these same exercises for numerous countries. But I think the framework is there. The ability to transform the market is what we've seen with living living building challenge. And I think that can happen anywhere, even in places that may be less transparent with their
Sure.
information.
All right, fair enough. Kwang, from Zoe Darcy, how do you manage to retain the same levels of productivity despite reducing the building footprint in your design? What were the key strategies adopted for the workflow design? I think that's a really salient question because we've been talking a lot about well-being as an outcome. How much of what you did actually facilitated the workflow and improved the workflow?
Yes, so actually before doing the project, we have to visit the current factory they have, and then we try to optimize what they have in the current version of the factory. So basically, in our project here, we learn like in the wooden furniture manufacture factory, it's not about how wide it is, the factory wings building, but it's about like how long it is, So by providing the longer production line, it is how we make it, we improve the production line, but we're trying to minimize the width of the building component. So like that, we can leave more the courtyard garden. So I had to say, I mean, like doing factories, in the end of the day is you, how to say, like, because most of the time people just build like a big shed and that's it. And with no studying, no improving. But in this case, we're just trying to, to study a little bit more about how, what is the best way for the that factory work, and then we can prove them by the length of the production line. Yeah.
So
and still minimizing the building footprint.
right.
Yeah.
So there was so you benchmarked it against current factories, but you then looked at the production line. So the building is much more tailored to the production processes rather than just building a big shed and leaving them to get on with it.
Yeah.
You were looking at the step by step of the production. What about your project, Chris? I suppose that question could just as well apply to you, to the Maritime Centre. We talk a lot about living building challenge, environmental impact, but what were the metrics of productivity? Did you come out of this with a clear idea that this had improved the workflows, the processes that the building was designed for?
Yeah, I think the idea of giving these folks a new way to work is something that's kind of revolutionary for the Fisherman's Terminal area. Certainly, being able to combine these, more modern workforce components, so the office area, but then having something that folks could work on kind of in a more industrial way. I mean, there's having this kind of maker space and tinkering space and ability for the folks to come right off the vessels and work with mechanical components and things, but then also combine that with the office piece is something that's a little bit new here for this particular industry. So I think we hold some great hope that that'll really influence kind of the next version of the green economy, or the blue economy is what they're calling it here.
Right. Last question, and I like to end every webinar with this, which is, what would you have done differently? Chris?
Yeah, it's always a tough one. I think, having known a little bit about the jurisdictional challenges we would have had with water, we would have simplified the design earlier on with that. But in general, I think we're happy with being able to have this kind of working waterfront building that meets all these performance criteria, and being able to utilize the community to help build it, I think has been something that we see a lot of great promise in to be replicable for the port, and it's been a great project to be a part of.
Same question, Kwang. If you had one thing to change, what would you have done differently?
Actually, like more or less the same with Chris. Like in the end of the day, we are designer, So if I would do it again, I'm gonna slightly change the massing of the factory, to be a little bit more efficient. Because back to that day, we don't have that much time to dive into the production line, So at the moment, I think some wing of the building can be slightly smaller. So we're going to do probably the better massing for the building if
you had a second go at it. Next factory, the next one.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both. I really enjoyed that. That's all the time we have. And I appreciate your participation. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And at this point, I'd like to invite Priya back to the stage for the closing remarks.
I want to summarize this and leave a little bit of food for thought for our audience. Chris's phrase, carrying capacity of the site, which has stuck with me, and I think it's something that everybody must think about before beginning to design. And Kwang's phrase of happiness, community happiness attached with an industrial program, which is something that doesn't really occur very naturally to most of us as designers of industrial programs. So I think these excellent thoughts would be something that all of our audience would carry with them at the end of our today's podcast. Before we leave, I'd really like to thank all of you for this great podcast and your very great participation. And for the audience, I'd like to remind all of them to take a look at our website if you'd like to read more about these projects. And I saw some questions some comments in the comment box where they'd like to see Chris's before and after transformation of the port. So there could be some information that can be posted on our website. So please check our website, look for the calendar for next webinar and podcast. It will be on May 14th. And I would close this podcast, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Priya.
Thank you.